Episode 2025A. D. An old captain of a time ship orbiting the Earth is stranded. In the last book, it was said that a spaceship from the future Mars made an emergency landing at the Sakurajime rocket launch site. This book will talk about the story of the spaceship drifting from the battlefield of Mars in 12,025 to the sky above the Earth in 2025, and the death of the old captain. In 12,025 AD, the Mars Space United Fleet reached the end of the orbit from Mars to Earth and entered the orbit around the Earth. The flagship was the space-time battleship Seashell. In the central command room of the Seashell, a girl with a sword on her waist listened to the radio call in the headphones and stared at the blue planet outside the spacecraft Earth. She was the daughter of the fleet commander and captain of the Seashell. The Idalu Samzi Taiju. The Idalu Jiguan. What happened? This starts with the immigration to Mars that year. 10,000 years ago in 2025 AD, the first batch of pioneers of the human beings on Earth set foot on Mars. After generations of exploration and immigration, Mars has become a planet more suitable for survival than Earth. Seeing the spacecraft returning from Mars loaded with gold, in people's minds, Mars is close to the asteroid belt. With a unique location and inexhaustible resources, it is simply a paradise. However, time changes everything. It will finally break out between the mother planet Earth and Mars, known as the Mars Independence War. It's a long story about this war, so I'll just mention it here. After the victory of the Mars Independence War, Mars and Earth signed a peace treaty. Mars became the second planet in the solar system to carry civilization after Earth. After independence, Mars continued to develop explosively in the long years that followed. The civilization of native Martians that once appeared on ancient Mars is called the first Martian civilization, also known as the prehistoric Martian civilization. The Martians of that civilization are also called prehistoric Martians. And this civilization, which started with the immigration of human beings from Earth, is called the second Martian civilization, referred to as the new Martian civilization. On the other hand, on Earth, the temperature of the seawater rose, the Antarctic ice sheet melted, and a large area of land was exposed, and the Antarctic Empire with the Antarctic continent as its territory appeared. After the ice and snow covering the Antarctic disappeared, the Antarctic Empire discovered a formation of space fleets left behind when the first Martian civilization was destroyed and the Earth colony was opened up. This fleet is the predecessor of the Galaxy Fleet. After repair and preparation, it can sail in the solar system. As a flagship, it is also equipped with anti-humara weapons. The sea level in the northern hemisphere rose. Coastal areas and islands were flooded. Extreme weather was raging. High temperatures, droughts, hurricanes, floods, and the natural environment deteriorated sharply. More and more places became unsuitable for human survival. The Antarctic Empire had a warm and humid climate, becoming a paradise for humans to escape famine and war. The power of the Antarctic Empire expanded rapidly, forming the Southern Federation with this country as the core, which almost covered the southern hemisphere. However, the fleet of the Antarctic Empire returning from the Pluto expedition accidentally escaped a virus. The Pluto virus, to which humans had no immunity at all, broke out globally. In a few years, the Earth's population was reduced by more than half, and the world's economy fell into a major recession. The Southern Federation once again launched war to expand its territory. The Southern Federation issued an ultimatum to the defeated Northern Alliance. If it did not surrender unconditionally within the deadline, it would launch a full-scale nuclear strike. The Northern Alliance held urgent consultations to discuss the war situation. Even if all nuclear weapons were put into the battlefield, there was no chance of winning in the face of the Southern Federation's antimatter weapons. Therefore, a request was made to the Southern Federation, cede half of the territory in exchange for ending the war and the cooperation between the North and the South to completely eliminate the Pluto virus. During the talks, the Southern Federation agreed to the Northern Alliance's request for peace, and the two sides drafted a peace treaty for ending the war, reconciliation between the North and the South, and comprehensive cooperation. However, both sides insisted that the prerequisite for ending the war was that the Mars Federation would mediate, preside over the signing of the peace treaty, and provide guarantees for the implementation of the peace treaty. After evaluation, the Mars Confederation Congress believed that if a nuclear war broke out on Earth and civilization faced the crisis of destruction, it would not allow Mars to remain alone. On the other hand, if the Northern Alliance surrendered unconditionally, Mars would become the last place that the Southern Federation dreamed of conquering. and interstellar war would also be inevitable, so the requests of both parties were agreed, and the joint fleet was dispatched to Earth for armed mediation as agreed. The atmosphere in the central command room of the Seashell was extremely solemn. The radar screen showed that military satellites were moving frequently in the outer space around the Earth. On the ground, the bomber formation had already taken off, and the intercontinental missiles also soared into the air and jumped out of the atmosphere. Suddenly, in several places in the northern hemisphere of the Earth, white flashes of explosions appeared one after another, then turned into red fireballs, and finally turned into mushroom clouds that stood tall. That was the bombing of a large nuclear bomb. The radio broadcast an instruction from the Mars headquarters through a quantum communication link. It has been learned that the plan has failed, and the action has been terminated. According to reliable intelligence, the Galactic Fleet has set sail for Mars, with the purpose of taking advantage of the defense of Mars to sneak attack Mars. Order your fleet to return immediately to defend Mars. After turning U-shape, the Mars United Fleet, led by the flagship Inamitsuropo, lined up in a long snake formation and sailed towards Mars. Suddenly, in the halo of the moon, some small black dots appeared. They became larger and larger. Finally, what appeared in people's field of vision was a formation of rapidly approaching space battleships. That was the Galactic Fleet of the Southern Federation of the Earth. The spacecraft sounded the alarm. The antimatter shells flew out of the muzzle of the main gun with a blue tail flame, and collided with the interceptor missiles fired by the enemy flagship in the dark space, bursting into dazzling flames. The explosions of the antimatter shells and interceptor missiles fired by the enemy and our flagships were like blue fireworks in the night sky. The missiles fired by the ships of both sides, with tail flames, interweaved a red and yellow fire net in the dark space. The deck vibrated, and a warning lighted up on the control panel. The side of the spacecraft was hit by an antimatter shell. Damn it! How can the Galaxy Fleet have so many antimatter shells? VI Guam heard that in the headphones. People were talking on the radio. For so many years, the raw materials at Mars supported the Southern Alliance for peaceful use. It seems that they have all been used to produce antimatter shells for war weapons. The alarm sounded again, and the captain's broadcast came over the radio. Order. This is the captain of the flagship. Order the No. To ship to pick up the flagship's bridge. All personnel on the flagship will be transferred to the No. To ship. Judging from the number of enemy ships, the enemy fleet has another guerrilla force heading to Mars. Order the No. To ship to act as the flagship and let the fleet to return to Mars at full speed immediately. In accordance with the Mars Homeland Defense Reserve Plan, the broadcast continued. This captain will stay with the ship to provide cover for the returning fleet, prevent the enemy fleet from pursuing, destroy the enemy flagship, and annihilate the enemy fleet. In the chaos of people moving to the No. To ship. VI Guam slipped back to her room and locked the door from the inside. The space-time battleship HAIB opened its engines at full speed, broke away from the fleet, and raided to a place where the enemy flagship's main gun could be clearly seen by the naked eye. The HAIB's violent main gun continuously ejected antimatter bombs. The 8 guns on both sides of the main turret fired nuclear shells. The enemy fleet was suppressed, and the United Fleet led by Ship No. took the opportunity to leave the battlefield and disappeared in the distance. The warships behind the flagship of the enemy fleet poked their heads out and tried to chase the Mars United Fleet. VI Guam walked out of the room quickly, stepped onto the deck, made a V sign to her father who was operating the main gun with a surprised expression, and stepped onto the control console of the gun. You focus on hitting the flagship, and leave the battleships behind to me, she said to her father on the transmitter, operated the sight, shot out a circular fire net, and trapped the enemy fleet in the middle. The captain reminded his daughter, fasten your seatbelts. I'm going to start the jump mode. After hearing his daughter's response, he pressed the continuous jump button. The battleship disappeared in front of the enemy in an instant and jumped hundreds of meters away. While the enemy fleet was searching for targets, the captain operated the main gun and fired quickly. A large hole was blown out of the side deck of the enemy flagship, and a fire broke out inside. VI Guam's guns also severely damaged the enemy fleet behind. 2 enemy warships exploded, broke away from the queue, and fell into the Earth's atmosphere. After several rounds of attacks, most of the enemy warships had been lost. Several large holes were also blown out of the side and deck of the enemy flagship, and fireworks were emitting. The enemy warships no longer cared about maintaining the formation or their own defense. and fired shells at the Martian flagship of the Sea Shell while surrounding it. The Seashell battleship intermittently jumped in space, destroying one enemy ship after another in the gaps between the enemy ship's firepower. The main gun operated by the captain hit the main turret of the enemy flagship, blowing the main gun away. The Idaluji Guam also abandoned other enemy ships and operated the 8 mounted guns to fire at the enemy flagship. Finally, the enemy flagship exploded and plunged into the atmosphere. After another 10 minutes of fighting, only 2 warships in the enemy fleet could still fire conventional shells. The Seashell was also badly damaged, and the main gun had no antimatter shells. The nuclear shells of the main and secondary guns were also used up, because there was not much antimatter fuel left. The small universe shield protecting the spacecraft also stopped working. After 5 minutes of bombardment with conventional shells, both sides ran out of shells. The last 2 warships of the enemy fleet were floating nearby, without firepower and almost all power. The Idaluji Guam was blown off the turret by the airflow of the explosion and fainted on the deck. On the enemy warship opposite, soldiers were calling the base on the ground for reinforcements. The power system of the Seashell Mars flagship was also severely damaged, losing 90 of its thrust. If this continues, if the enemy reinforcements arrive, it will be difficult to get rid of the enemy ships. The captain tried to start the space-time engine again. Fortunately, it succeeded. After adjusting the thrust of the space-time engine, the damaged spacecraft vibrated violently. The space-time engine trembled and gasped weakly, and the microscopic protection shield was weakened almost non-existent. The control panel showed that the power supply cable was blown off. The output of the space-time engine was weakened, and the flagship was lost. The captain walked out of the spacecraft and entered space to repair the broken cables on the damaged side of the spacecraft. The 3 soldiers on the enemy ship next to them saw an opportunity and drove the space motorboat to board the flagship. The captain saw them approaching with knives, so he had to interrupt his work and climb to the deck. The captain was still a few meters away from the deck, and those people had walked to the edge of the deck, holding their knives high, and were about to cut the safety rope connecting the warship to the captain. The figure of Idaluji Guam suddenly appeared. She jumped into the air, and the sword in her hand drew a long arc in the air. The 3 invaders were chopped down before they understood what was happening. The captain finally connected the cable. He had no time to return to the deck, and used the radio to instruct his daughter to go to the control console to increase the thrust of the space-time engine and monitor the navigation. The space-time engine has restored some thrust and is running more smoothly. The 2 enemy ships that were just there have disappeared without a trace. The Seashell has left the battlefield. However, the sound of the space-time engine is getting weaker and weaker, and the surrounding space-time is shaking and distorting uncomfortably. The captain told his daughter that the battleship encountered a space-time vortex due to insufficient antimatter fuel. When the sound of the engine disappeared, the space-time monitor on the console showed range 10, 0 years, 0 kilometers, current location, September 15, 2025 AD, above the Earth. The Idaluji Guam has been trying, and the space-time engine barely restarted successfully, but because the antimatter fuel is almost exhausted, the engine can only maintain an idling state, unable to start the spacecraft's small universe protection shield. The spacecraft cannot continue to travel through time, and cannot escape the gravity of the Earth. It can only drift near the satellite orbit and barely make short-distance orbit changes. The captain is moving toward the deck along the hanging ladder on the outside of the spacecraft. The console issued a rapid warning. The radar screen showed that the flagship was above the orbit of dense communication satellites. This is a space cemetery, and scrapped and damaged satellites are pushed to this height to survive here. Satellite parts, wreckage, fragments, and space junk that are large or small, collide and separate in the space around the flagship, passing by at high speed. An accident happened, and a group of solar panel fragments flew rapidly and drowned the old captain. The cable connecting the deck and the captain was also cut. When Idaluji Guam ran over to see, there was only one empty cable floating and jumping in the air. Idaluji Guam kept calling her father on the radio. She only heard her father say, "Daughter, I'm leaving. The spaceship is in your hands." After that, the only response to her call was the noise of the radio. She saw through the telescope that her father, wearing a special spacesuit for the flagship captain, was reflecting the sunlight, flying away from the flagship, and flying farther and farther in space. Finally, She couldn't see him even when the telescope was adjusted to the maximum magnification. The more urgent alarm sounded on the console brought the Dalu Jiguang back to reality. The autopilot system of Da Huangjian reminded that the fuel was in a hurry. If it was driven manually, it would be dangerous to land with the remaining thrust of the engine. The artificial intelligence control system reminded that through the analysis of the detected radio signals, it was determined that there was a space base below, and it was recommended that the intelligent operating system take over the spacecraft, enter the atmosphere, and make an emergency landing there. The Dalu Jiguang reluctantly returned to the driver's seat and pressed the green button for the autopilot. The battleship plunged into the atmosphere, wrapped in flames generated by friction with the surrounding air, and descended to the rocket launch site on the surface below.